Hey, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Wildcast podcast presented by the Arizona Daily Star, Tucson.com, and the Wildcaster. I'm Brett Ferris, sports editor of the Star, here with Justin Spears, our Arizona football beat writer, and Michael Lev, our senior writer and columnist. We're here to talk about part of our ongoing Big 12 Blitz series, introducing the Big 12 schools, cities, stadiums, communities, mascots, traditions, everything you can think of surrounding the new Big 12 programs that the Arizona Wildcats will be affiliated with, both in a conference sense and competing against on the field of play across the many, many sports that Arizona has, that most of the Big 12 schools have less than. But that's obviously part of the whole story. But we're here today to talk about a familiar one of sorts, and then also one that's kind of new to Arizona, but not new to everybody in the Big 12. It's the Utah schools, Utah and BYU. Both part of the Big 12 now. BYU has been in the Big 12 for 1 year so far. It was independent for about 13 seasons prior to that. And previously before that, BYU was in the Mountain West and the WAC at the same time that Utah was. So the two schools in that sort of Salt Lake City larger market, BYU's in Provo, but it's not far outside of Salt Lake City, were together, at least for football and other sports, in the same conferences. But then the last 13 years or so weren't. As Utah joined the Pac-12 and BYU was independent. So we were kind of talking before we started rolling today, guys, about just how it's kind of neat to have not just Arizona's chance to play these two schools. Obviously, Utah and Arizona have built some good competition over the years across all sports, but to see Utah and BYU in the same conference again is kind of neat. The holy war component of sports is back.
If there is a positive outcome to conference realignment, it's that some of the rivalries that we had come to know and love are back, right? BYU and Utah is one of them. Texas and Texas A&M is the other one that springs to mind. Unfortunately, some have been broken up because of this, like Oklahoma and Oklahoma State, not regularly playing each other. I don't know if they're playing each other at all in any sports this first year. It was nice to see that Oregon and Oregon State and Washington State were able to come to some sort of agreement to keep going and with their rivalries. I'm sure that those schools will be playing each other in baseball when the time comes, because it's really hard to schedule in that particular sport, maybe softball too. But yeah, BYU and Utah, great rivalry between the two of them. And Arizona's, even though BYU hasn't been in the Pac-12, Arizona's played BYU a bunch in recent years. I want to say
multiple sports, not just football.
Yeah, I want to say the first game under Jed Fish was against BYU, right?
At Allegiant Stadium.
At Allegiant Stadium.
Yep, at Allegiant Stadium, site of the Big 12 media days. I don't know how to sort of wrap my head around all of that. That's all kind of very, very strange. But very competitive game against BYU. I think both of them have kind of a similar DNA when it comes to football. They tend to have a lot of guys who go on missions, so they're gone for a year or two. They come back. They're older, they're big, they're physical, they're strong. You're often feels like you might have your 18 and 19-year-olds going up against 22 and 23-year-olds in the trenches, which can make things very difficult. I thought because of that BYU wouldn't have as tough a time making that transition from independent to the Big 12, but man, they did have a tough time last year, and it seems like there is going to be an adjustment period for them. They went 2-7 in Big 12 play, and to me, that kind of puts Kalani Sitake on the hot seat a little bit, anyway. Just the
hold on real quick.
Yeah.
Kalani Sitake, you actually wrote a story on Tucson.com about the coaches who have a lot to coach for this season. Where did you put Kalani on that list?
Pressure, yeah. The pressure rankings is what I called it. And I had him, I believe, number 5. I'll look it up here while we're talking.
Wait, if he was number 5, wasn't Brennan number 6?
If you had, I think 7. If you look at the
7,
trend
okay.
here for BYU, they had 11 wins in that weird 2020 season, right, where they played a super funky schedule and got great quarterback play. And then 10 wins, and then 8 wins, and then 5 wins. So that's kind of steadily going downhill, right?
Yeah.
So I think even though the two schools share a lot. They are definitely in different situations as far as the health of their football programs. I had Kalani Sitake 5th on that list to which coaches are under the most pressure this year. My top 4 were Deion Sanders, Dave Aranda, Scott Satterfield, and Neil Brown. I had Brent Brennan 7th on that list. But
I'm wondering, though, traditionally, when you think about the last several decades, I feel like Utah has been the better football program over the last 20 years. But prior to that, is it fair to say that BYU was the better program and more nationally relevant with Steve Young and Sark and all the other NFL players?
Jim McMahon, yeah.
Jim McMahon,
yeah.
I'd argue that. I mean, that was in the 80s that they won the national championship. And obviously those national championships have some mythical elements to them because a lot of teams didn't face each other. And that BYU team, I think 84 is definitely questioned as to whether or not they played a schedule worthy of a national champion. But then you get into the 90s, and we've talked about this, Justin, when we were at Big 12 Media Days, and you wrote about it. You can see it at Tucson.com and in the Daily Star in our Big 12 Blitz package about Utah. Was Kyle Whittingham was the first person to sit there and say, like, this realignment's old hat for me. I've been through this. Yeah, he started in 94 as an assistant coach at Utah under Ron McBride, a former U of A assistant coach, was the head coach at Utah. Whittingham was an assistant, stayed through McBride, I think one more coach, and then Urban Meyer.
Yeah.
And then took over as the head coach. And this will be his 20th season. So since 94, 30 years there, he's seen 4 different conferences, 3 different realignments. So it's interesting to correlate that change, that sort of shift we're talking about with Kyle Whittingham. And yes, Urban Meyer, and obviously what he did to elevate that program fast, but what Urban Meyer has done to sustain it. 16 bowl games in 19 seasons. I don't care if you're going to a 6-6 bowl game every year. 16 bowl games in 19 seasons is insane and pretty amazing. And so Utah absolutely has been up there in that capacity.
Yeah. To Justin's point, BYU has a national championship in football.
Yeah.
1984. Right. They were 13-0. This was peak of the Lavelle Edwards era. They were playing a brand of football that not a lot of the country played at that point in time. You know, it was a wide open passing attack. Everybody does that now. But we're talking about the 1980s and the 1990s. And it was still a lot of, I formation or the option or kind of basing your offense around the running game or a star running back. And BYU is much more known for the passing game, for quarterbacks.
My favorite college football player for many years was Steve Sarkisian. Way before he went to El Camino College in Southern California, in Torrance, California, and then transferred to BYU. And man, was a gunslinger in that offense in the early 90s. And I loved him, and I was shocked. I didn't know better. I was a kid, so I didn't know better. Like, how is this guy not going to the pros? Because he was not the body size and style of quarterback. But and then all of a sudden, he can't get away from major college football. So
Lavelle Edwards coached at BYU for 29 years and won 257 wins, 101 losses, 3 ties, 71.6%. Winning percentage. So pretty good.
How many wins against his rival?
Against Utah?
Against the other school, right? Because those
are the games that matter. Up while we're live.
But I was just thinking about this just now. It's called the Holy War. That's the name of the rivalry. And there's just a lot of connection to the LDS religion. Is this the only college football rivalry that's kind of intertwined with religion in some capacity?
I mean, there's you could maybe make a
Notre Dame Miami.
I was gonna say Notre Dame Boston College, sort of.
But Notre Dame Boston College is a good one. Yeah.
Okay.
But Notre Dame Miami, Catholics versus convicts, I guess, has the religion intertwined with that. Yeah, I don't know. It's interesting. It's an interesting question. I mean, but what it shows is the cultural elements of that region of the country and that state. Yeah. And how ingrained it is to both schools. We're doing, and I'm not trying to say this in a disparaging way, as we do research for this Big 12 project, I'm looking at things like Princeton Review and U.S. News and World Report and those rankings they do, which a lot of it's flawed, but it's based on surveys that are given to students. And, both the schools, very conservative student bases, both schools are highly ranked in places you will not want to go have a beer or pot's not hot is one of the categories, and both schools are highly ranked on that list. So it's interesting how socially and community wise the dynamics, and I'm not trying to be cliche about it. But it is tied to the component of where religion fits into the greater Salt Lake region. And that's interesting too, is the fact that Provo's his own city, but it's not, you're basically in suburban Salt Lake. And so geographically, they're still heavily connected. I mean, it's very much a UCLA USC dynamic in terms of owning the region, because it's not even like ASU and Tucson and Tempe and Tucson and having 90 miles between the two. I mean, they're very much on top of each other.
What I was going to say, is it fair to say, like, for people in Tucson listening, Provo is pretty much Casa Grande in terms of location to Tucson?
I think it's closer even. But the reality, what's interesting too, and this isn't what you were going with, is the opportunity for Arizona to build rivalries, a relatively decent LDS population in the state of Arizona. When we've seen BYU and Arizona play in Glendale, played in Vegas, the opportunity from people that I've talked to build future rivalries with specifically BYU, and then continue obviously growing one with Utah, is very, very intriguing to a lot of folks in the state of Arizona because of connections to both the schools, but specifically BYU. So I think it's going to be interesting to see that. You know, Lev, you said earlier, you talked about sort of matchups and things. One that sticks out in my mind in terms of Arizona's connection to these schools was longer ago than I thought, 15 years ago, which kind of shocked me. But Justin, you'll know enough about this one. But who's the all-time scoring champion for a men's basketball game in McHale Center? Who holds the record for most points in a basketball game in McHale?
Oh, Jimmer.
Jimmer dropped 49 in, I think, Sean Miller's second season, maybe first
year.
season.
I was there.
2009, a 99-69 final, I think, or 93-63, something along those lines.
Yeah, and Sean Miller was mad because apparently they took him out to like a nice dinner, or BYU basketball team to a nice dinner, and Sean Miller was like, "We took this guy, gave him a nice steak, and then he dropped 49 on us. We're never hosting BYU ever again."
So Arizona does have some history with BYU in particular. Obviously, Utah. You know, one thing that was interesting, I think, Justin, when you had talked to, so one of the interviews we did was with Adrian Denny. He's the local voice for the Tucson Roadrunners for the last 7 seasons, and he's from Salt Lake City, a Utah alum, knows the market very well. Was a play-by-play and multimedia TV and radio host up in Salt Lake for a while, and so we talked to him about Utah and this. And one thing he said is that you asked him sort of about other sports, not so much football and men's basketball, but what other sports sort of drive the conversation. And he was very complimentary of women's basketball and sort of their rise, which parallels a little bit of what U of A has done under Adia Barnes. But he said the one that surprises him that isn't better than they are is baseball. And that's why I want to bring that up. We ask Lev. Lev is our kind of baseball expert in the house, of that they're good, they're okay, but you'd think that just that the market that a lot of that they would be able to sort of be an upper echelon contender of sorts. And I wanted to get your take, Michael, if you kind of see that too.
I don't find it to be that surprising because the weather is the big hindrance, right?
But what about Oregon State?
They're the outlier to me. I mean, they have managed to overcome it. You know, sometimes it's just you get a great coach who is able to just.
It's like Gonzaga basketball.
Yeah, kind of like that. I mean, you get that one coach who's able to overcome all the obstacles and make it into something. Now, Utah had a really good year in baseball this last year. They're building a new stadium. They've been playing in the AAA stadium,
which is huge, by the way.
Which is really big. So
for perspective,
it looks like no one's there.
For perspective, that stadium is bigger than the AAA park that the Oakland A's will be playing in next year in Sacramento. So, you know, they're moving the A's to a ballpark in Sacramento. It's going to hold about 14,000. That park in Salt Lake City, which is a beautiful park. Salt Lake Bees play there. Great park, but it's big. It's like 16,000 people.
The A's should move to Salt Lake City. That'd be a better idea, like the Coyotes did. So that's to me the biggest hindrance. And also, like, who do you play? There's really not a lot of like schools within driving distance. Justin, you were talking about Provo. It's about 45 miles away. I guess you could play Utah. I think they call it Utah Tech now. Used to be Dixie State.
Dixie.
And there's just not a lot of opponents in the area, so it's hard to build up your resume, you know. in the offseason. But it'll be interesting to see with this with the new ballpark. I think they're going to see 1,200, which seems super small, but that's how I kind of like the intimate venues sometimes, especially in college sports, being able to create some sort of an atmosphere. So I'll be interested to see how that goes. BYU does have baseball as well. One more thing I wanted to mention about BYU is because it's so strongly connected to the Mormon faith, it's a national brand, right? When we were back in the days, year and a half ago or so, when we were talking about what can the Pac-12 do.
I thought you were going to say the 80s,
when
they were winning their national title, but you mean like a year and a half ago?
Yes.
Back in the day.
I mean a year and a half ago, before everything changed. We were talking about how can the Pac-12 elevate its profile. Like going after BYU would have been a great move, right? BYU had its own media deal with ESPN.
Yeah.
They were an independent, so they had to have a deal with somebody, but they're so big, so popular nationwide that ESPN felt like they were, a worthwhile partner. So, I mean, it's a high profile and very prominent and popular athletic program. Utah, the other thing about Utah that's interesting is women's gymnastics.
Oh yeah. I meant to bring this up. Thank you.
One of the best, if not the best program in the country.
Nine national championships. Yeah. They haven't won one in about 20 years, but 9 national titles. They're still a top 6, top 7 program in the country. Yep. The craziest part is that we talk about stadiums that hold 15,000 people. They pack 15,000 people for most gymnastics meets in the Huntsman Center on the campus at Utah. I mean, talk about an extra. It's kind of, Arizona with softball, though it's only 3,000 to 4,000. Like, it's like what sports outside of your core of football, men's basketball, women's basketball do you kind of get to also claim? That's a major coup for Utah to have that. And BYU does actually draws pretty well too for gymnastics, not to that number, but it's pretty amazing. I mean, LSU went and competed there last year, and that, it was standing room only and tickets for sale on StubHub. And I mean, it's great. It's not something you expect. That's why I sound incredulous. It's not because it shouldn't be, but it's not something you expect with college gymnastics for sure.
And
but
don't they also have Olympic facilities in their back pocket?
Well, that's an interesting
trials
part
up there for gymnastics.
Not just gymnastics, but a lot of stuff. So the fact that the 2002 Winter Olympics were held in Salt Lake has been a big deal for Utah as an athletic department. You could make an argument that Utah's rise, Greg Hansen chronicles this a little bit in his introductory column in the Utah portion of the Big 12 Blitz series, how Utah's rise into sort of a power program. I mean, and again, we got to remember they're only 15 years removed from being a mid-major, but they are on the upper echelon. Take away the Learfield Cup, because there's some exceptions to that and how teams win and stuff like that. You could have Arizona and Utah in the 40s and teams that win an archery or a shooting, riflery title because it's a national championship could be in the 20s. It's a weird dynamic. So taking that off the table for a second, the actual physical rankings, we can all say Utah's athletic department is fairly competitive in a lot of ways. A couple of years ago, Mark Harlan, U of A alum, former U of A assistant athletic director, was the national athletic director of the year 2 years ago when Utah won 10 conference championships in the Pac-12. I mean, pretty nuts for one season. So competitive. I bring that up because when the football stadium, which used to be Rice Stadium, was basically torn down almost to just one little bleacher side was left to be rebuilt as Rice-Eccles Stadium in the late 90s to lead into them hosting the Winter Olympics and being the site for the openings and closing ceremonies, that changed the profile of that university. It gave them a major conference stadium feel for being a mid-major, which allowed for their eventual move more than a decade later to the Pac-12 and so on. So your point, Justin, is more than just even the one sport. I think it's across a lot of things, not to mention we're not even talking about Utah has their number one sport in terms of championships is skiing, co-ed skiing. And I don't have the number in front of me. It's in our package, so take a look at Big 12 Blitz, but they win just about every year. They were the runner up this past year. The winner, Colorado, their new rival in the Pac-12 and Big 12. But that's also the other part of it is the world-class skiing, which is why the Winter Olympics were there. And the Winter Olympics are probably going to be there again in 2034. That's the other piece to this, is because they have the stadium already in place at Rice-Eccles, because of all the other facilities in town, they're already there. That's a big part of the Coyotes hockey operations shifting there, is the likelihood of the evolved community and a rebuilt Delta Center that can house them in the next few years, because they're going to need facilities probably to house the Olympics.
Guessing not a lot of Big 12 schools have skiing programs.
Well, they have
Two.
skeet
Well,
shooting.
we know that Colorado does because they're the defending national champs. But
yeah, I don't think there's not a lot of hills in Lawrence or
Utah was the
Manhattan,
4-time
Kansas.
defending champ before that.
Not a lot of snow down here, so
yeah. Softball's
Still,
another one, by the way, not to forget that.
Yeah.
Utah in 2023
Yeah.
went to the College World Series with Alyssa Benstrom, a Canyon Del Oro grad, basically their best player. She was a grad student in 2023, so was done playing after that year, but was a 2-time All-American, 3 or 4-time All Pac-12 performer. But went to the College World Series for the first time in, I think, 30 years, maybe 20 years or 30 years, couple of decades minimum. So that program is definitely on the rise in terms of the dispersed Pac-12 teams that have been sort of highly competitive in the sport. You know, your Oregons, Arizonas, it's at UCLA, obviously.
And there's definitely a feeling like with Arizona softball that they're going to instantly, be the number one program in the Big 12, and Utah has been just as good the last few years.
Right. It's good for Arizona, though, to have Utah and a rising ASU to join them on that front, too, in the Big 12. It's definitely going to be interesting. Before we wrap this up, any last thoughts about Utah and BYU and sort of bringing these together with
I have a question for you guys. So a couple of years ago, when Utah was really rolling and Arizona football was still on the come up, hadn't kind of crossed the threshold, I wrote something to the effect, I think it was a tweet, that Utah is the role model for Arizona. Like, this is what Arizona should aspire to be. Like a great home field advantage, physical program, consistently winning, 8 to 10 games a year, right? And there was a lot of blowback among Arizona fans. They just felt like Utah, we should strive to be better than that. Utah is not good enough for us.
Can I say what I said at the beginning?
Lev, strive to be better than 4 Pac-12 championship appearances.
16 bowl games in 19 years.
And I think I know which side of the argument you guys are on. You guys are on the Jedfish side. Jedfish was like, yes, this is exactly what we want to be. So I think that's where you guys are at as well.
Well, there's a realisticness to it, a reality to it as well. And it sounds crazy to say that because it's 16 bowl games in 19 years and Fiesta Bowls and, big time, Rose Bowls, Pac-12 championships. Are those realistic? Obviously in Arizona land, the last two things haven't been, but at the same time, there has to be an acceptance of very good is still very good. And I don't think, and I think history plays a role. Arizona basketball has a chance to continue to be great because it's been Arizona basketball. Arizona football has to make baby steps in its climb. And I think striving for Utah is probably bigger than baby steps. So I'm on board with that. And even to this day, I still think that's a fair enough goal.
And maybe Utah baseball can figure out a way to start winning some games and start being a successful program because, kind of like women's basketball, the Pac-12 was just loaded from top to bottom with teams. I feel like the Big 12 isn't quite the same conference as the Pac-12. Lev, would you agree?
In baseball?
In baseball, yeah. So maybe that could benefit Utah.
It'll be close, but I understand where you're going with that. I think maybe it's more applicable to softball. That being the case, where it's not quite. I mean, the Pac-12 was absolutely loaded in softball, so you could easily go 500 or even below 500 and still make the NCAA tournament because your strength of schedule would be so strong. It's kind of like the SEC is in a lot of sports. I think Big 12 baseball is maybe a little bit more respected in the metrics than Pac-12 baseball was. So we'll see how that goes. Football wise, Utah's picked to win the conference this year.
Yep.
I have a little reservation about that because I kind of feel like I want to see Cam Rising play.
Me too.
Before I sign off on this, the guy missed an entire season with a horrific knee injury, including torn ligaments I'd never even heard of, that I didn't even know existed in the knee. So let's see him play. Let's see him make it through a season before we anoint Utah as the kings of the new league here.
At the same time, I think that we have to remember Utah went 7-4 last season with Bryson Barnes at quarterback, who was serviceable, but it was not what Cam Rising was prior. So I think that their makeup is top of the pack or top of the Big 12, but I agree with you 100%, Michael, that we've got to see Cam Rising come back. He's also aging a little bit. What's he, like 35? So like, at some point no, I'm kidding.
25.
But he might be older than Justin.
But
no,
didn't I hear that he could have another year left after this year?
No.
Yeah, no, it's true. Yeah,
no way.
Yeah.
He could literally have like a 9th year.
There was a court ruling where they're trying to kind of go back, and anyone who lost a year from transferring during a certain time period might be able to get that year back if they're still in school. So he might be able to have.
Yeah, he's entering his 7th season, and he does have an option to play an 8th year at Utah if he wants.
Yeah. You guys know he's a year younger than Justin Herbert.
I thought you were going to say you, and I was going to say
no.
Wait, he's just 1 year younger than Justin Herbert. Okay.
Who's in his 4th year in the league?
Who just got a new contract.
But how many years has Herbert been in the NFL? 4 years?
4, yeah. I think he's entering his 5th, right?
I mean, that's a career, right? For most guys, that's a career. 5 years as a quarterback in the NFL.
I mean, the fact that the guy who is a year younger than you is already on a 2nd contract in the NFL, and we're sitting here talking about this guy possibly getting another year, is just absolutely wild to me. But this is the day and age that we live in with COVID and transfer portal and all that. It's wild. But going back to your guys' point about talk about how, Utah and BYU, how they connect to Arizona now that they're making this move into the transition. I think that from a post or outside ASU rivalry, I think that those two schools immediately come to mind for me just because of the history, like you guys mentioned, like Lev bringing up the 2021 season opener at Allegiant Stadium. I'll never forget the season opener in 2018 when a lot of people were very optimistic about the match of Kevin Sumlin and Khalil Tate and how maybe Kevin Sumlin could, use his Johnny Manziel tactics with Khalil Tate, and maybe Khalil could be a Heisman hopeful. And within the first 2 quarters of that game, we knew that, okay, this is going to be a little bit of a project. And then I also go back to the Mike Stoops era when Nick Folk was, kicking walk-off field goals against BYU. And then a couple years later, Arizona ending the 10-year bowl drought in 2008 against BYU in Las Vegas. And then, once Utah got into the Pac-12, Arizona chasing Utah, trying to get that standard and do what Utah has been doing, which is winning a lot of football games and being so consistent at it. So there's a lot of connections between the 3 schools. And another connection that I think is, very well known, has been well documented, is the strong Polynesian culture with BYU, with Utah, with the LDS religion. It goes all the way to the Hawaiian Islands. And so if you look at BYU and Utah's roster, a lot of Polynesian players. When you look at Arizona's roster, which started all the way back with Dick Tomey in the 90s, Arizona has done a great job of getting Polynesian players to come over. So I think outside of ASU guys, I think those 2 schools are probably the best rivals that Arizona has when it comes to football.
Yeah, BYU is a sneaky good rival for Arizona in football for all the reasons that you mentioned, Justin. I'm currently working on a column about how there are just no more divisions in college football anymore. There's only one conference that has divisions anymore. That's the Sun Belt. And because of that, I mean, you could get these really disparate schedules. I am very hopeful that Arizona will continue to play, the Rocky Mountain schools every single year. I don't know if that's going to be the case though, as we get deeper and deeper into this. I love the regionality of college sports. I like divisions. I like one of the reasons I think we like the Pac-12. It was our thing over on the West Coast,
Yep.
So hopefully they will continue to play each other annually, but I don't know if that's going to be the case years down the road.
So one last thought on the idea of regionality and divisions. Justin, I'm going to let you know right now that when you go to cover Utah, you're just going to stay there for 2 weeks. We'll have Lev and others pinch hit back here against Texas Tech the next week, since Utah and BYU, the games up there are 2 weeks apart. So no, I'm just kidding. You're not going to have to stay up there, but you could, if you really wanted, you could take a week off and we could figure it out. But more so, you're going to figure out the path of how best to get yourself to that region. You don't have to fly into Salt Lake to get to Provo per se, but it probably is the most likely likely course of action and path. But yeah, that happens to be 2 weeks apart. Arizona plays Utah on September 28th, a Saturday at Rice Eccles Stadium. And then 2 weeks later on October 12th at BYU at Lavelle Edwards Stadium. In between, Texas Tech is here in Tucson. So it is not the ability. I was hoping when the schedule was talking about it that we were going to be able to just send you up there and have you live there for 10 days, but not going to work out. Just
a reminder for everybody, Arizona plays Kansas State in week 3. That is not a conference game. That was a right. Non-conference game that had previously been scheduled that they couldn't like untangle themselves from. And the first official Big 12 game is actually against former Pac-12 colleague Utah the following week.
Here's some trivia before we go. Other than ASU, we'll take ASU off the table. Tempe's about 90 miles north here of Tucson. Who is the closest geographical rival in the Big 12 to Arizona now?
Texas Tech, yeah?
It's Texas Tech, then it's BYU, then it's Utah. Texas Tech is a little bit closer than the two of them. So all three of those teams, one of them in Tucson, but all three of those teams in back-to-back weeks. So we talk about rivalry potential. It could be 3 straight weeks of existing with Utah, but also new budding rivalries with Texas Tech and BYU. Michael Lev, our senior writer, columnist, thank you. Justin Spears, Arizona football beat writer. We'll have plenty more for you here at Tucson.com and the Wildcaster and in the Arizona Daily Star with Big 12 Blitz. Thanks for listening now. Also, be sure to check out Justin's football coverage leading up to the start of the season with fall camp starting soon. By the time you listen to this, it might already be underway, but find all of your U of A football preseason coverage from Justin Spears and Michael Lev at Tucson.com and the Wildcaster app. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.